Welcome, everyone, to Dmitri and Silverado Policy Accelerator. We're absolutely thrilled to have you here for this event this afternoon about evaluating the Biden administration's Russia policy. Where do we go next? I could not be more pleased to introduce the incredible panel of Russia experts who will be joining us today. This is truly a star-studded group, and we're thrilled to have them all with us today. First, we have our friend and colleague, Matthew Rojansky, the director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. Matt is as much a regular at congressional briefings and on primetime news shows as he is on the streets of Moscow, Kiev, and Berlin. One of the country's leading analysts on US-Russia relations and focus on Ukraine and the region. He has advised governments and international organizations and leads Track 2 diplomacy on Eurasian conflicts. And he is also a member of the Silverado Strategic Council. Welcome, Matt. We're also joined by Anna Arutunyan, a prolific Russian-American journalist and author. Anna has covered over a decade of Russian politics and society as a reporter and editor at the Moscow News, Russia's oldest English language weekly. Her articles have regularly appeared in the USA Today and other publications worldwide. She's the author of 3 books on Russia, the latest of which is The Putin Mystique, translated into over a dozen languages. Last, but certainly not least, we have Professor Mark Galeotti, honorary professor at UCL School of Slavonic and East European Studies and senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. A renowned expert and prolific author on transnational crime and Russian security affairs, Mark is also senior non-resident fellow at the Institute of International Relations Prague and the former head of its Center for European Security. A prolific author, his most recent book is called We Need to Talk About Putin, published in 2019. And he's the author of and host of the Moscow Shadows, a terrific blog and podcast on contemporary Russian politics. He also writes regularly for the Moscow Times, Ram of Ruslan, Business New Europe, and many other outlets. Mark is also a member of our Strategic Council. So welcome all, and thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to discuss Russia and the Biden administration's emergent policy to it. In addition to our panelists, we have a great audience here today on Zoom and watching on the YouTube live stream, including an array of current and former senior government officials, private sector colleagues, academics, members of the press, and thought leaders from around the globe. Thank you all for joining us. At any time throughout the event, we invite the audience to submit questions using the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll reserve some time at the end to turn to those questions. Before we jump in, I'd like to share a bit about our newly launched nonprofit organization, Silverado Policy Accelerator. My co-founder, Maureen Hinman, and I started Silverado earlier this year to accelerate the adoption and implementation of novel bipartisan solutions to critical policy challenges and to ensure that those policies yield concrete results. We've hit the ground running since our launch in February, with projects underway in each of our 3 pillars of focus: cybersecurity, international trade and industrial security, and economic and ecological security. The thread that connects these 3 areas is also the subject of our event tonight. Great power competition, and more specifically, competition between the US, Russia, and China. So let's dive into it. Anna, first question to you. You're right now based in Moscow. We, of course, just had the election in the Russian Duma, the Russian parliament. The result was not surprising, and one might even say predetermined. With United Russia, Kremlin's party winning a supermajority over 70 seats in the parliament. And it was also not surprising to see widespread fraud taking place throughout the election. What was interesting to me, though, is the blatant nature of the fraud. It was just so in your face this year. We've seen the famous videos of poll workers blocking cameras while mysterious hands pop up behind them, shoving ballots into the ballot boxes. We've seen doppelganger candidates pop up who legally changed their name to be the same name as the opposition candidate in a particular district election, and even shave their face and hair to match the appearance of that candidate to make sure that the supporters of opposition candidates would be confused about which candidate to vote for. We've seen introduction of parties that are named similar to main parties like the Communist Party of Russia in order to confuse voters. It all seems so blatant and in your face that it almost makes me wonder specifically about the ability of the Russian government to do cheating well these days. like you, I was born in Moscow, and one of the things that always struck me about my experience growing up as a kid in Russia, going to school in a Soviet school system versus then coming to the United States, is the different attitude that people had towards cheating in Russia. It was sort of pride in the school system to cheat on exams, to find elaborate contraptions and build them to do the cheating. And oftentimes people would put more effort into doing the cheating than it would have taken them to actually study for the exam and do well on it. And there was pride in beating the system and not getting caught. And I just wonder, has all of that disappeared? Has all that competency and cheating well dissipated after the fall of the Soviet Union, that we're seeing these blatant attempts that are just so in your face? And I also wonder about the purpose of it all. Obviously, Vladimir Putin wanted to have an election where his party would win a landslide candidacy, but that was never a landslide number of seats in parliament. That was never in doubt. And if you're trying to show and have an election that at least instills some legitimacy domestically or internationally, it seems that this blatant cheating goes counter to that. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the more positive aspects that we could, but that's in the international arena. But I mean, yes, I will start with the elections, since that is certainly on everybody's mind. Look, I have to say, I've been watching this going on for 20 years. I was an election observer in 2012. It happened again, and then it happened again, and now it happened again. Have I observed anything particularly new in terms of the cheating and vote rigging? Systemically, not really. I think we're really talking about the scope and the extent of the ballot stuffing and the manipulation. We do have with the new online voting, there's this whole controversy that in the liberal sector, people are saying, well, Venediktov, Echo Moskvy were promoting this, and actually the authorities used it to rig the elections. Yes, probably. I mean, am I surprised by this point? No. I mean, it comes to a point where, like, what are we to expect? And I think this is really some of the, I mean, this is unfortunate, it's very sad, it's very demoralizing, but this has become the view of a lot of, in terms of domestic politics, this is just really what it is. And it's going to be this way until, I don't want to say it, until we see a new administration, if I'm being polite, right? So, I mean, I think that the key change I'm seeing is the response, the social response, and I think that the crackdown on protesters over the last year, the suppression of the media, which is completely unprecedented, all these foreign agent laws, this climate, this growing climate of fear, coupled with, I think, a bit of just COVID fears as well. The result is we're not really seeing people protesting against this. I think there's a certain resignation that this is not going to change under this in this government, and right now it's just too dangerous to try. So, but I mean, I did want to say, like, since we are talking about U.S.-Russia relations, I did want to, like, for a moment put domestic politics aside and see if I could, like, focus on the positive for a bit. And the thing is, I've been back here in Moscow for a little under a month, and specifically where U.S.-Russia relations are concerned, I still feel that there's still that bit of positive momentum from the summit, from the Biden-Putin summit in June. And despite some of the bellicose rhetoric you're inevitably going to hear from pundits and parliamentarians on both sides of the Atlantic, Russian policymakers that I've been talking to on either side of the political spectrum were very happy with the summit and have high hopes that this is indeed the start of some kind of dialogue. Now, what does that exactly mean? Again, what did Biden achieve? What is there to be happy about? I mean, after all, there weren't really any significant breakthroughs or deals. Sanctions are still mounting. Bad things are still happening in Russia. We saw what happened in the elections. But I think the real breakthrough, and I say this having watched this conversation both in Moscow and in DC, is honesty. Now, again, like we can put aside what we're seeing in the media because that is going to be very, the rhetoric is going to be very belligerent. But when they talk like in private and when they're preparing for meetings, for instance, from Secretary Nuland. They have a very positive outlook on all of this because, again, the Russians have been managing their expectations for quite some time. One Russian policymaker of the nationalist persuasion described Biden to me as a cynic. And believe me, in the Russian context, in the way he said this is as much of a compliment as you're going to get. See, the thing is, I mean, whether accurately or not, the Kremlin feels genuinely betrayed by the United States, by what it perceives as double standards, moral grandstanding, lecturing, maligning, and yes, interference in its political process. In a situation like this, it's gotten to the point where you can't really convince Putin otherwise. You can't debunk these various convictions by arguing that they're not based on reality or whatnot. It's just going to aggravate an already very precarious relationship where international security is concerned. So I think the success of the Geneva summit was that Biden went in there understanding that he's neither going to convince Putin of anything, nor is he really going to change his behavior. And instead, there was a recognition that some dialogue on things where Russia and the US can actually be of use to each other as equals is better for both than no dialogue at all. Certainly better for international security. In the West, in some circles, some may have seen this as a capitulation, and I see this instead as honesty, and which under the circumstances also requires a great deal of bravery. I don't know if this honesty is a posture that the Biden administration can sustain, but I can only hope it does. There is some hope that it will. And key to that is managing expectations, not promising your allies or especially yourself things that aren't going to happen. And a good example of that is Ukraine. I mean, should the Biden administration continue supporting Ukraine? Absolutely. Is that support going, if that support is going to involve stringing Ukraine along with false promises about NATO membership, something that we know is never going to happen, this only aggravates tensions that can tip over into military conflict that the US has no interest in getting involved in. And another is, back to the question of domestic politics and the domestic opposition. And I'm going to say something deeply unpopular, but I've, being back here in Moscow, I've thought a lot about this. Navalny is in jail. The non-systemic opposition has been gutted to a point that there were hardly any protests after the elections, as we've seen. And in the context of US-Russia relations, for having this conversation in that context, the truth is there is not much the US can do about that. Sanctions and pressure, often lobbied by people who are safely outside of Russia, do little to help the journalists and activists who are struggling to build civil society here. At worst, they can make it even less safe to practice either. Now, this is obviously terrible. This is, the Russians, we have seen them responding to whatever their beliefs about what the United States is doing by punishing people at home. We've seen this happen. It's been happening. It might happen again. So going forward, I think we should recognize that at this stage, America has neither carrots nor sticks it actually wants to wield. And if it really wants to build leverage, it really needs to focus on the carrots first, which I think is what the latest the Biden administration has been doing. And I think that's a really positive sign.
Great. Well, we'll dive in more into the U.S. side of the policy here and evaluate the Geneva summit. But Mark, a little bit more on the election. Let me ask you, as a historian, is Stalin turning over in his grave, looking at the fact that today's Russia is incapable to even stealing an election well? And again, similar question to Anna, what is the point if you're trying to manage it and trying to show popular support? Doesn't this blatant cheating undermine it?
even better when unmuted. First of all, let's be clear. Look, this is not a Stalinist system. This is not even a Chinese system. This is still some kind of a hybrid democracy. Now, especially in the last year, it's got less hybrid. But nonetheless, I mean, the scope for some kind of debate actually really still does exist within this system, so long as you don't actually expect that to manifest itself in power. And I think, therefore, the big challenge for the Kremlin this time round was, first of all, they had set themselves the task of holding on to this constitutional majority, this 2/3 majority. Not, I think, because they had particular ambitions to further constitutional changes, not least because if that's what they needed, then they can just simply rely on votes from the so-called systemic opposition, the parties that are kind of not really opposition parties. Instead, it was just simply because, having had a constitutional majority before, they didn't want to lose it. And then everyone would be thinking, aha, you see, the system is on the slide. I mean, actually, what we are talking about, to characterize it in slightly sort of, extreme terms, is a bunch of paranoid and scared old men who are aware that there are tectonic plates shifting beneath their feet and are just trying desperately to hold things together to their own advantage. So in a way, yes, there had to be a constitutional majority, and yet this is at a time in which actually there is a growing feeling not so much of sort of active opposition as just simply dissatisfaction. I mean, I've called this kind of the coalition of the fed up. It's not that there is a huge movement that is either directly supporting, whether it's Alexei Navalny or any other specific movement, just a lot of people who, for all kinds of different reasons, are feeling fed up. They feel that the state has broken its social contract with them, which was more or less, you stay out of politics and we'll look after you. Well, ever since 2014 in particular, Russians do not feel, unless they are the microscopic proportion of people at the very top of the system close to Putin, they do not feel looked after. Quite the opposite. They have actually felt that their quality of life diminish over time. And maybe it's local issues, maybe it's environmental issues, often it's economic issues. It's, is my kid going to have a better life than me? All kinds of contributing to this sense of dissatisfaction. And this is, after all, what made Navalny dangerous, because for an authoritarian regime, actually, especially a modern one, it's not so much fear that they rely on as apathy. Convincing people, look, that change is either impossible, or if it did happen, it would be for the worse. So don't even bother. Just focus on just living your day-to-day life. Well, the Navalny, whatever else, he was actually quite successful in catalyzing some sense of hope and optimism. And that's, again, one of the things that made him dangerous. So that kind of dissatisfaction is there. And therefore, given that the Kremlin clearly had set out as sort of an instruction that the political technologists of the presidential administration had to deliver, well, then they had to use whatever means at their disposal. And in some ways, they've also got a limited range of instruments. So they had to be pretty, frankly, crude about how they did it, because in a way, that was the only option at their disposal. And to a large extent, what seems to have happened is they didn't just invent a whole bunch of votes for the governing United Russia Party. They also stole a fair number from the Communist Party, which is, again, it's going to create an interesting situation in the future, because the Communist Party, being one of these systemic opposition parties, but nonetheless is kind of being pushed by a younger generation of activists who actually feel that opposition parties should oppose. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But a final point I would want to make, sorry, can I just make just one final point before I forget it, otherwise, is just actually sometimes the crassness, the obviousness is actually a message in and of itself. I do wonder if sometimes, particularly with figures who have been either associated with or were supported by Navalny in their smart voting, I feel sometimes maybe the scale and the obviousness of the vote rigging was just to make a point. If you have anything to do with Navalny, or maybe some future Navalny or whatever, we will go out of our way to crush you, to burn you, and to bury you. So again, I think this is also part of a regime that feels at risk. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, but to quote Stalin, it doesn't matter who votes, it matters who counts. So you don't think that it would have been sufficient or preferable to simply just adjust the count at the end without the ballot stuffing, without the doppelgangers and everything else that we've seen that was so blatant?
Well, I think that firstly, it's hard just to, at the last scale, because there are people who are paying attention, although there was much less scope for election monitors this time around. There are people who are paying attention. I think it would have been quite difficult just simply to, in the last minute, just suddenly sort of announce a whole variety of very questionable votes, well, unless you happen to be in Chechnya. But the other thing is, you say, I mean, yes, there's that classic Stalin quote, which is chillingly accurate in many ways. But in the modern world, particularly in the era of smartphones and webcams and everything else, it also matters who watches the vote. And I think this is the key thing, and it goes back to what Anna was saying about the sort of, the sentiment within Russia, is that, look, yes, Russians, to a large extent, are expecting these elections to be rigged. But there is also an element of a kind of an understanding of what are acceptable levels of dishonesty. And as we saw in Belarus, a really blatant, just simply announcement of a result that totally doesn't have any resonance with the reality can actually generate a significant backlash driven just simply by a sense of outrage. I think that's something that the Kremlin was trying to avoid. So they're trying to make it a little bit more granular in the process.
Got it. Stealing a little bit, not too much. So Matt, let's turn it over to the US side. As Anna mentioned, we had the Geneva summit between Biden and Putin. What do you think the US strategy was going to the summit? What were they hoping to achieve? And what do you think they got?
Well, thank you, Dmitri. And I very much appreciate your and Maureen's initiative with Silverado and including me in this and the other work. The most frustrating thing about Washington is that good ideas are plenty, but they seldom move. And I think the idea here is not only to hear the good ideas, to see if they can move. I like to go to primary sources. So let's go with Joe Biden's words on what he was trying to achieve in the summit. He said in April, when he proposed the summit, which Putin agreed to, the following: where it is in the interest of the United States to work with Russia, we should and we will. Where Russia seeks to violate the interests of the United States, we will respond, and we will stand in defense of our country, our institutions, our people, and our allies. That was further refined in some comments from Jake Sullivan and the Interim National Security Strategic Guidance, in essence saying that the goal is a predictable, stable relationship. I know that's a phrase that we've all heard several times, that part of that is having clear communications at all levels, of course, including the presidential level, and to seek some kind of what have been called guardrails on Russia's conduct. But at the time, what officials said was, this is an untested idea. So in a sense, give us the time and space to work through this idea. Let's see if it works. Some time has passed, admittedly not a lot. It's been months, not years, but I think it is fair to ask, where are we? I'd look at a couple of baskets. Number one, just the dialogue itself. There are now several tracks of dialogue. There's the summit level, which you open with. Geneva was mostly good news in the absence of really cataclysmic bad news, right? It was not a Trump-Putin Helsinki summit that became kind of public political media scandal. There were no polemics on either side. There was a certain grudging mutual respect that was intentionally signaled. And despite some verbal fireworks both before and afterwards, that's been pretty consistent in the way that the two leaders talk about one another. And it's only been 3 months since Geneva. There's also a strategic stability dialogue that has had one formal meeting. It's headed by Wendy Sherman, Deputy Secretary of State, and Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov. Look, I'll be honest, it's mostly talking about talking at this point. But that said, it's going to be a long slog. This is about replacing the one major remaining U.S.-Russian nuclear arms control treaty, the New START agreement. That's the main task. That's complicated. It's technical. It's hard to do. The big question mark in my mind is, even if we assume that a post-New START treaty will come out of this strategic stability dialogue, can we use it the way that arms control was historically used in the Cold War as a gateway to broader management of the relationship, to maintaining stability in that relationship in regional conflicts, in conventional military, and by the way, also in cyberspace, something you and I, Dmitri, have written and talked a lot about, which brings me to the cyber dialogue. As you know, and probably a lot of the listeners know very well, there have been at least 4 official meetings of the cyber dialogue, and my guess is a number of additional conversations. I think it'd be inaccurate to say that there's anything like a breakthrough in the offing there. All of the signaling is that the same basic problem set persists. To me, and Dmitri, I think, I know you agree with this, that suggests that we have been ineffective at either delivering a credible threat or offering something that the Russians want, because I simply reject the notion that the Russians cannot deliver, for example, on stopping ransomware that has Russian origins, if they want to do so. I think the Kremlin could deliver on that. And then there's another track which we read about just in the last day or so, the military dialogue between the chiefs of defense. That's a very good thing. As our chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, put it, when major power military chiefs talk to each other, the world's a safer place. He had nothing further to say about what was discussed in Helsinki yesterday. I'm fine with that. My assumption is that, like their conversation in March, it could play a helpful role in de-escalating tensions in the region. And, in the kind of dogs that didn't bark category, think about all the post-Soviet conflicts that have not flared up, right? Belarus, for all of the terrible violence against citizens, has not become an international conflict. The Zapad military exercise did not turn into a shooting war between Baltic or East European NATO allies and Russia/Belarus. We have not seen a major flare-up, thank goodness, in the Caucasus. So, I'm not saying there's direct one-to-one there, but it's good that the chiefs of defense are talking to each other. Afghanistan is the big, I think, if not question mark, at least sort of gauntlet that's been thrown down. And that is, in an amazing kind of full circle of human history, Russia is back as a power broker in Afghanistan. I've even heard Afghans say that in retrospect, after the debacle of the US pullout, that the Soviet occupation looks better. That they built lasting infrastructure and institutions, that the government held out, the security forces held out for at least longer. Now, that's not the main reason why Russia has influence today. It has influence because Russian representatives have been dealing directly with the Taliban for years. But that's the reality. And Russia has influence with the Central Asian republics as well, the former Soviet neighbors of Afghanistan. And that's going to mean that if the United States cares at all about Afghanistan, which I'm certain that we do, part of that road is going to go through Moscow. And let's not forget, it was when Joe Biden was vice president and when many of our current officials were in the government doing national security jobs, that the Northern Distribution Network deal was worked out with Moscow to supply NATO forces in Afghanistan. So there's a precedent for that conversation. There's a lot more we could talk about. Let me just make one final note here, a little bit of concern. I fully understand and morally am very supportive of the president's focus on a kind of authoritarianism versus democracy global framework. You heard it again in his address to the UN General Assembly. It is very clear within that framework which side of the barricade Russia is on. But that also puts Russia on the Chinese side of the barricade and with a number of other unsavory and potentially pretty disruptive folks. I am not sure that framing is consistent with the administration's desire for a stable, predictable relationship. In other words, that starts to look to me like the recipe for a lot more asymmetric escalation, unpredictability, and instability in the relationship. So for me, I'm not saying that supporting democracy is wrong. It's very right. But how do you reconcile that messaging with a more pragmatic relationship with Moscow so as to avoid escalation? I have yet to see how the administration resolves that.
That's a great point. Of course, our support for democracy only goes so far when it comes to the allies we actually need, like Saudi Arabia and others that are just as bad, or if not worse, at authoritarianism than Russia. Let me ask, though, maybe we'll go back to Mark and Anna. On the Russian side of Geneva, what do you think the Russians wanted to achieve, both out of Geneva and broadly speaking, what is it that they want the most from the United States? What are their objectives for where this relationship is going to go?
Anna, do you want to take that first, and I'll follow on?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think that interestingly, this, back to this question of managed expectations, The Russians have for years not expected much. They, again, they had a very dim view of the relationship. They have been convinced for a long time that the United States is simply seeking to undermine Russia at all costs. We're not going to get into whether that's accurate or not again, but so I think what they were going into, is again this issue. Let's talk about something. Let's see what the United States has to offer for us, because it is true that we like to think that, oh, the Russians need us more than we need them, but do they really? I mean, I think in terms of issues like Afghanistan, Syria, even cybersecurity, the Russians have reached a point where they're pretty confident in this idea that, look, we're vested in these. We're there, unlike you, and we have skills and know-how that we're willing to share if you start treating us as a partner, as not as a partner. Let's say partner is a little bit too strong, but at least as an equal. And I think that is really what they're hoping for, simply to be treated as an equal in terms of power. Do they feel they're going to achieve that? Absolutely not. Again, they're going into this thinking it's not. It is what it is. But again, with a conversation that Biden and Putin had in Geneva, and again, I think a lot of what Matt said here is really important, because there is a lot of inconsistency in what the messages that the United States is conveying as really a problem. But I think that that initial conversation between Biden and Putin, it showed to the Russians that okay, we might not ever reach parity, but at least this is a pragmatic and honest politician that we can at least deal with. Whoever comes afterwards, we don't know, but that's at least the start of a pragmatic, interest-based rather than values-based conversation. And I think that's what makes the Russians happy. Again, their expectations, I think, are a lot lower than American ones, and I think that's a good thing. I wish that the U.S. could like manage its expectations as well. But I think really that's where we stand right now.
Mark, what are your thoughts?
Yeah.
Do you see any sort of transactional view from Russia that if we're going to give in on ransomware, we expect X, Y, and Z in return, or do they simply want to be treated as an equal?
Well, in a way, the two are not necessarily opposite poles. I mean, to go back to this point that Matt raised about the fact of the sort of the American belief that what it really wants is a predictable, stable relationship with the Kremlin. Well, I think one of the reasons for the particular Russian approach is that up to now, they have felt that it does not pay for them to give Washington a predictable, stable relationship. Their view is essentially that they only get anything from America when they are a problem for America. And I mean, the classic example of that was after all Syria in 2015. It came at a time when the Obama administration was trying, in effect, diplomatically to isolate Russia. And so, although there's a whole variety of reasons why they went into Syria, I mean, it's absolutely clear that part of that was, no, you don't get to do that to us. We will inject ourselves into an area that matters to you and force you to talk to us. And then it followed, Putin unusually actually went to the UN General Assembly, and there was this monstrously uncomfortable photo opportunity with President Obama, which again, in some ways, from the Russian point of view, that discomfort was the point. It was fairly clear, he didn't want to be talking to Putin, but he had to. So, I mean, I think this is the kind of relationship that has obtained up to now, which from the Russians' point of view is not great, but it was the best they had. So when they went in, I mean, the hope was precisely on their part that they were going in to talk to, firstly, a grown-up with whom they could actually sort of have a proper conversation, but also one who actually had the capacity to bring Congress along with him. Because I mean, this was one of the issues about Trump. It didn't really matter what you could get Trump to agree to. There was no way that the Congress would allow him to do anything. So, I mean, I think they went in hoping just to get some signs that there was room for, in some ways, it to be worth their while, not to be a constant irritant. And even just on intangibles, but very, very powerful intangibles, like President Biden's rhetoric, which sort of was giving Russia respect. And we have to realize, look, we talk about interests, but foreign policy is ultimately determined by usually relative handfuls of individuals in each country who are thus that, they are people. And if you look at sort of Putin and the people around him, they're pretty much all of that same 65 to 75-year-old Homo Sovieticus smarting at the loss of superpower status. So, things like that actually really do matter. So yes, they went in just to see if there was any reason for them not to be the bad boys of the geopolitical scene. And I think they left thinking, maybe. Again, I agree with that. I don't think they went in starry-eyed, and they certainly didn't leave starry-eyed, but I think they left feeling that there was opportunity. But on the other hand, given that up to now, their only card has been the spoiler, the joker, let's say, they're certainly not going to abandon it until they're pretty sure that it's in their interest to do so. And this is where the American ambiguity is a problem. Because in a way, I think they felt that after Geneva, the implication of the American position was that up to a point, what happens in Russia stays in Russia. And now the talk about the whole sort of, in a way, creating exactly two teams. And if you're not in one team, then you are by definition in the authoritarian team. Once again, gives them cause to think, well, hang on a minute, we're not quite sure what the situation is. But again, these are things that can be addressed. But again, it shows that sort of no one summit is going to somehow unlock a great new sunlit upland for us all.
And just to follow up, Mark, what do you think they're waiting for? Because it's clear, as Matt has alluded to, the discussions have gone on in areas of strategic stability, in the areas of cyber. And I know in cyber, certain requests have been made from the American side, and there does not appear to have been any responses from the Russian side, at least in terms of actual actions against these ransomware groups. So if they're waiting, what else are they waiting on, do you think?
Well, I think one of the things is precisely kind of clarity about how far the United States plans to push a sort of a values-based, well, a selectively values-based policy. And in that respect, I think these elections therefore pose an opportunity, if a very unfortunate and ruthless one, in the sense of, yes, they were very blatantly rigged. And obviously the United States will, must, and should note that. But how far does it go? So I think one of them is that they're waiting to see, again, over time, how America responds to what's going on within Russia and how far America makes it its business. So that's thing number one. But thing number two is, I think that the problem is that we have a tendency to look at things siloed. Okay, we want, for example, progress on cybersecurity. What do you want on cybersecurity, and what can you give on cybersecurity? The Russians actually have a much more holistic point. In a way, from their point of view, they have a strength in cybersecurity, or rather, they have something that they can potentially offer. But it's not actually necessarily in the cybersecurity area that they are looking for movement. So again, I think that they're more or less sort of still sitting there thinking, well, okay, what can you offer us that actually matters to us if you want to get something that matters to you? And that, I think, is again, go back to this word cynical, the cynical conversation that one way or the other hasn't been had yet.
Matt, to follow up on that, if that is indeed the game that Russia is playing, that they don't want to see siloed conversations on cyber, strategic stability, or other matters, that they want to trade one against the other, do you think that the US administration is organized for success to confront that strategy?
Well, I think that organization is not the principal difficulty. The principal difficulty is essentially making a political judgment call. Mark is right that the atmosphere, indeed, President Biden himself, I think, said this when he was physically in Geneva, that foreign policy in his half century of experience is about people talking to each other. I'm sure there are other senior folks like John Kerry in the administration who would agree to with him on that. But the fundamental dilemma is, does President Biden or somebody speaking with his authority signal that a decision has been made about how to resolve some of these dilemmas, these competing stakeholder interests, if you want to call them that. I mean, the main reason that the United States can't offer Russia the sorts of assurances, spheres of influence, the kinds of things that Russia wants, yes, it's a principled reason, but there are also ally and partner interests, vital interests that are at stake. And we have never been able to resolve. And I think we have examples now of that tension basically completely undermining otherwise reasonable policy coming from Washington, a zero-sum dilemma like between Berlin and Kiev on Nord Stream 2. And of course, each side has congressional allies and lobbyists and, all kinds of ways to bring pressure to bear. I say we in terms of the collective Washington, but the administration has been unable to resolve that dilemma. It has made a series of decisions, but not a single one of them has, decisively and finally closed off the question such that elusive stability and predictability can be pursued. And I think from the Russian side, seeing that uncertainty both inclines a group of, fairly conservative-minded people, at least when it comes to their own power, to not take too much risk, right? To not put really any eggs, certainly not too many eggs in this basket of some type of, mini reset with the Biden administration. It's just not something they're going to do. But it also reminds them that just as, those on the other side of any given issue from them bring their full ammunition, politically and otherwise, the Russians need to continue to bring ammunition. And again, I don't mean to continue to put words in your mouth, Dmitri, but I think you and I agreed, because we've certainly written it, that, certain kinds of cyber mischief making start to look like very attractive, asymmetric, ways of escalating. Basically, when the Russians can't impose meaningful economic sanctions on the United States, the Russians don't have effective lobbyists, or congressional allies. So what do? They escalate in the areas where they can. And I think that's the dynamic that this Russia policy is, well conceived as it is on the very, very macro level. Of course, nobody wants an unstable relationship between the world's two leading nuclear powers, of course. But it continues to fall into that dilemma.
Let's do a question for everyone. We'll start with Anna, then go to Mark and Matt, and then we'll go to audience questions. But here's a question for all three of you. You're advising President Biden. What would you advise him on Russia policy? What would you advise him on what we should be doing in concrete steps to get to a better state in U.S.-Russia relations? What would you like to see the United States do? So Anna, let's go to you first.
I think this in many ways, we all three of us have kind of drawn on this. I think from where I sit, from Moscow, I think the most problematic issue in how the U.S. has traditionally handled Russia is inconsistency. And I think this is I made this point about Ukraine and promising things that you can't really deliver on. That is certainly something that's going to have to be worked out. This administration, I think, in general, I don't know to what extent this is possible given the various the various wings in DC of what people want. But the U.S. really needs to decide what exactly does it want, because again, this issue for many years, for many generations, I think there's been a complacency that it is enough to just stand for democracy and be against authoritarianism. That's no longer enough. Just by standing for democracy and standing up for democracy and decrying abuses, it's like the world has changed. And I think the United States, in some ways, this is an internal dilemma. It's also grappling with on its own. What does it mean to be a democracy? Well, not to get into too wider discussion on liberalism in general, but I think that this is, each administration going forward, especially this one, is going to have to decide what exactly does it want from Russia, and think in terms of what is it realistically to expect, because getting Russia to get out of Ukraine, that's no longer in something that the US can do. Getting Russia to free Navalny, getting Putin to change his behavior in domestic politics, same thing. So I think really there needs to be a more consistent, coherent look at what can be done elsewhere to build up, areas where Russians see an opportunity rather than a threat.
Mark, what would you do?
Yeah, I mean, following on from this sort of ode to realism, I mean, I think first of all, understand that in fact this is something for the long haul, because one may be able to change the actions of the Kremlin in specific ways because they are pragmatic. I mean, they are not engaged in some grand ideological normative struggle with us. This is, a bunch of aging kleptocrats holding on to power and also thinking about their place in history. So in that context, we will be able to make tactical changes to how they act and maybe encourage them to make a deal here, encourage them to stop a particular form of to use the current word, malign action there. But we're not going to convince Putin that actually we're his friends and that there isn't some grand conspiratorial Western plan to try and marginalize Russia and deny it the great power status that it deserves in their eyes. So we are in for a long haul of containment. And so that involves, a lot of it is actually about just simply shoring up our own status, because the Russians, this is a relatively weak country in many ways. It just simply exploits our own weaknesses, the places where we fail to do what we claim to do. And that means at the same time, I mean, part and parcel of that containment means, I think, again, finding the right balance between where we can find areas of common interest. And strategic stability is one actually that the Russians also are interested in. But again, they have a different concept of what that means. If you look at the writings about strategic stability, we think of it in very much nuclear terms. They think of it as nuclear plus lots of other things. So again, one of the problems is often we're just talking different languages. But anyway, find the areas of climate change, I mentioned, others where there is room for productive cooperation. And yet at the same time, there's nothing wrong with robustly pushing back against other areas. I mean, the recent case, for example, of HMS Defender, this British warship that sailed close to Crimea and then the Russians got very aggravated about. If you read the sort of telegram channels of Russian military types and so forth, it's clear that for all the furor in Moscow, they actually recognize that this was a legitimate operation that was handled well. I mean, I wouldn't really want to say that Erdogan's Turkey is a good role model for America in almost any way, except in this one. It's that actually, their relationship with Russia is one in which when they want to cooperate, they cooperate. When a Russian bomber was crossing over Turkish airspace, the Turks shot it down. And in the immediate moment, Putin was visibly furious and there were sanctions and so forth. But actually, when it came down to it, it was the Russians who in effect backed down. Erdogan issued a non-apology of the "I'm sorry I had to shoot down your plane" variety, and the Russians actually kind of accepted that. They expect other countries to be robust in defense of their national interests. I mean, one of the problems they often have is, and especially this applies to the European Union, when they don't feel that's being done. So accept that it's a long-term struggle for containment, find those areas of pragmatic common interest, push back robustly when necessary. And the final point is, but at the same time, accept that this is ultimately not an eternal struggle. This is very much, I would suggest, a generational thing. If you look at the next political generation, they're still kleptocrats in Russia, but nonetheless, I think they're much more pragmatic. They don't have this kind of visceral imperial instinct. So, what we're also doing is actually preparing the ground for the next great small r revolution in Russia as the next political generation comes in. it's a difficult balance, and it requires a very clear and very realistic sense of what we want, what we can do, and what will actually work with Russia.
Another revolution. Wow, I'm not sure the world can afford one. Another revolution in Russia. But Matt, Mark was channeling Kennan a little bit with his containment strategy. You're the director of the Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center. What would you do if you were advising President Biden?
I'm going to do the, rule of three, mainly because I recognize the most valuable commodity in Washington is the president's time, and I doubt very much he'd listen beyond, number one, but I'll try for three anyway. Number one, and it's not going to be popular because I think the administration has tried as much as possible to silo the issues, is find a way forward with Zelensky in Ukraine. The poison within the Russia-West relationship of the ongoing war, the open war between Moscow and Kiev, is not going to go away. And it's going to obliterate everything else that can be achieved in the relationship. What is that way forward with Zelensky going to be? Clearly, it's not just giving him a summit meeting. He's, other than getting the meeting, he has to get something. It's not going to be Nord Stream 2. That would be a reversal of a position the administration's already taken. It would really piss off the Germans. It's clear they don't want to do that. It's not going to be a date certain for NATO membership. They've been clear about that already. It's not going to be money, although money is always welcome. Money can help. But relative to the $85 billion of weapons that keeps being bandied about in Afghanistan, the Ukrainians already feel they're getting shortchanged, and we don't have the resources to change that perception. So I think it's Donbass. I think that although there is clearly daylight between Moscow's position and Kiev's position, I don't think that there's enough daylight that throwing the Minsk baby out with the bathwater and saying there's just no basis to negotiate here to end this war, to hold elections, to restore Ukrainian control of the border. I think that this is doable. This is what diplomats do, but this is where I put the energy. This is issue number one, because you resolve this, you at least manage this, you stop the open war between Russia and Ukraine, and that poison pill that can basically ruin relations with Russia, for the foreseeable future, at least can be contained. Second, and this one won't surprise you, Dmitri, pick a policy on ransomware. Just pick a policy. Either we're cooperating, and I hear noises that we're cooperating from people I totally trust, but if that's the case, there's a give and take to cooperation, right? We're cooperating right now in such a bounded way that we really can't give anything, and it's not surprising, therefore, the Russians keep trying to take. Alternatively, we're willing to go to the mat on this, right? We're willing to basically credibly threaten catastrophic punishment and then follow through on it if the Russians don't cooperate. But right now, we're kind of neither fish nor fowl, and we're still in a wait and see. And all I would say to you is imagine if the drip, 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 drip continues indefinitely. That is another poison that basically makes everything else that happens in this relationship irrelevant. The third thing I would say, and this is a good in and of itself, but I also think it will serve a strategic purpose, is we've got to restore the people-to-people track in this relationship. We have allowed the security services, principally on the Russian side, but a little bit on our side as well, to completely hijack the connection between 300 million Americans and 150 million Russians. And that is where, I say that as the director of the Kennan Institute, that's where I sit. It has become nightmarishly difficult, even impossible, to establish normal working partnerships with Russian organizations because of the foreign agent laws, even individuals now who are subject to the foreign agent designations. It's impossible to get visas because of this automatic tit-for-tat consulate closure and personnel problems that we've had. I am not saying that there is a light switch solution to this. I know both sides would like to solve it if they could, but there are all kinds of contingencies that they're not able to resolve. I would simply say this: if Toria Nuland could write in Foreign Affairs, as she did, I think, a year and a half or so ago, that the United States should offer visa-free travel to all Russians under the age of 40, I don't think I'm mischaracterizing her idea. And of course, she's now number 3 in the State Department. Then that's possible, right? I mean, Toria is known for her hawkish views on Russia. That's the kind of creative thinking that we need. We need something that fundamentally changes the game so Russians and Americans can get reconnected with one another. And yes, in that atmosphere, I'd also like to see a fully staffed political section in the embassy so that we can have regular, dialogue, which we don't even really have now. But fix the people-to-people ties. It's a good in and of itself. Vladimir Putin can come, he can go, but it matters that Russians and Americans are connected to one another.
Great. Well, let's go to audience questions, and please try to be brief. We're coming up on the top of the hour. Mark, let me give you this question. There seems to be this idea that if the West just sanctions Putin's inner circle enough, the regime will change course. In your view, would this result in any positive change or completely backfire? Doesn't seem to have worked yet.
Yeah, I don't actually think that this is a policy that'll work. Now, look, I'm perfectly comfortable with sanctioning kleptocrats, thieves, and the corrupt. Why should we want them here? Why should we want their money here? But let's treat it as something that's valuable in its own right, rather than thinking that this is somehow the instrument. There is this kind of pervasive myth that, oh, it's all about the money. Do we honestly believe that, for example, Putin is envisaging a future at which some point he will stand down and he will perhaps, buy himself a pleasing mansion somewhere in the Caribbean and then feature in, pro-am celebrity golf matches or whatever? No, I mean, this is a man who knows that ultimately, if he does stand down, and that's a big if, but if he does, and he travels beyond Russia, I mean, think of the war crimes tribunals, think of the Interpol red notices, that will be flocking his way. So this is not people who are, in the classic form, salting money away in foreign bank accounts for the day in which they leave. Their power is their currency. And so I think, that these are not people who are really susceptible to that. And from Putin's point of view, he has been trying to, quote unquote, de-offshorize, ghastly word, money of the oligarchs, trying to get them to bring them back to Russia, where, of course, it's in his grasp. So ironically, the sanctions regime actually acts as a perverse advantage to that. So no, I mean, I have no problem with sanctions, but let us not delude us that somehow we will reach a point where there is enough sanctions that is going to make Putin play nice. Not at all.
Anna, a question here about the Communist Party. What are the odds that it will split and some of the radical elements of the party who are getting fed up with the managed democracy will form their own political movement?
Well, I think that's a process that's been going on in some ways for many years. The trouble is, will the Kremlin allow that to happen? And as we've seen in this round, it hasn't. We have to understand that the Communist Party is part of the systemic opposition. The Communist Party that is headed by Zyuganov is part of the systemic opposition. There are a lot of non-systemic communists that the Kremlin is, especially ones that have kind of like, as Mark rightly pointed out, that have that Navalny tinge on them. Those are the ones that the Kremlin is going to crack down hard on. And that is, in many ways, that's a question that depends on how the regime responds to what it perceives as a threat of protest and revolution. So in many ways, yes, that is possible, but I think that's something that we're going to see down the line. And I mean, many years, possibly after Putin. That's the short answer.
Great. Well, unfortunately, we're drawing to the end of the hour, but I will ask one last question, and please, just a one-word answer. I'll give you a choice. Post-Putin, whether it's in 12 years or sooner, whoever replaces him, are they more likely to be from the Siloviki fashion, sort of the Shoigus, the Naryshkins of the world, or are they more likely to be a reformer, perhaps another Gorbachev that's somewhere in the backdrop of the United Russia Party right now? So Anna, you first, reformer or Siloviki?
Honestly, I know you want a one-word answer, but I'm going to say somewhere in between. It could possibly be a Silovik with reformer, with reformist intentions. That's my prognosis.
Mark?
Yeah, you couldn't have had Gorbachev without Andropov, the hardline Silovik, to kind of force reform onto the agenda. That, I suspect, is what we can do. And frankly, if it was Shoigu, I could see Shoigu actually as the midwife of progress.
Wow. Matt?
Thank you for saying that, Mark. I was thinking the same thing. I will say, Dmitri, that whoever it will be, the odds that the level of talent and strength it would have taken to rise up in the late Soviet system will be there in Putin's system, I think are much lower. I think it's going to be someone who is non-threatening to Putin for as long as possible.
Great. Although, of course, Putin was not seen as threatening to Yeltsin, and look at the direction that we've gotten. Well, we are at the top of the hour. Thank you so much, Matt, Anna, and Mark. This was an incredibly enlightening and really informative discussion. Much like Russia itself, the topic contains far too much territory for us to cover in one go, let alone in 1 hour. But I cannot thank you enough for your thoughtful engagement on these issues and for taking time to talk with us today. I also greatly appreciate the audience participation and excellent questions. Silverado will make this event available for viewing on our website and YouTube channel. To keep up with Silverado's upcoming work and events, please visit our website or check us out on Twitter and LinkedIn. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.